Hi, thanks for joining. I'm Austin Davis. I'm the Government Affairs Manager with the Lake Champlain Chamber, and I'm joined by three fantastic attorneys from the Greater Burlington area who have agreed to sit down and chat about issues bubbling up and percolating on the employment landscape in our region. And for this discussion, we're going to talk about generally just kind of workplace volatility and clashes that are stemming from current events. And there'll be two kind of trajectories on this conversation. First, stemming around from um, what's happening in the work environment due to COVID fatigue, as we're many months into new restrictions and new workplace conditions that are starting to kind of wear on everybody. And then the second kind of trajectory will be politics in the workplace and how this national election is creating some tension as the line between what's political speech and what's just conversation kind of is blurred sometimes. So without further ado, Heather, I guess could you lay the landscape out for us here? Around, I guess we'll start with the just general workplace COVID fatigue and some of the issues we're seeing there.
Sure. I think that, as you say, Austin, there is a general level of employee fatigue that we're seeing and volatility in the workplace that likely stems from a number of factors. The pandemic certainly being one of them, the divisiveness in our nation around the election and politics being another major issue. And I think because of that, there is increased tension and friction in all aspects of one's lives, and that includes for employees in the workplace. And so I think today we're going to talk about maybe some legal issues that raises, as well as some practical or sort of business pragmatic advice that we might offer or ask employers to think about in terms of trying to manage these issues.
So, Ben, what do let's kind of jump into just kind of how a COVID fatigue can manifest itself in terms of OSHA and OSHA guidelines and a copacetic work environment.
Well, I know from conversations with Kerin that she's perhaps worked on that issue recently a little bit more than I have. So I'd be happy to defer to Kerin specifically with the OSHA question. What I will say, Austin, is that I think that, OSHA gets implicated when these issues with respect to volatility are really boiling over and are increasing, are creating unsafe work environments sort of in and of itself because of those boiling over points. I suppose what I would also like to mention is sort of what I'm seeing more often, even before sort of issues reach that boiling point, is just general distress among employees, general fatigue with respect to these issues. And that's manifesting itself in many ways. And we could be here for many hours talking about the different ways in which that's manifesting itself. But just to give you sort of a couple examples here. Obviously, we don't know what's to come this winter with respect to COVID. And I think there's been some alarm here in Vermont as of late with an uptick in cases as we've seen nationwide. But as of late, here in Vermont, thankfully, because of our numbers, more employers have been able to consider reopening. As you can see, I'm in my office right now. A lot of tension, though, exists between employers and asking employees to come back into the office. A lot of employees, for various reasons, whether it be because of situations at home, because of personal health concerns, have serious concerns about that, and it's creating significant disputes between employers and their employees that implicates a number of laws, both those that existed before COVID, like the FMLA or the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as some new laws and regulations that have come around, like the FFCRA and some paid leave laws. Some other examples that I see sort of coming on the horizon here in particular are, we have Thanksgiving coming up at the end of November. We have Christmas and New Year's coming up at the end of December. Employees are going to want to visit their families. If you've seen the most recent travel map here in Vermont, the red counties are closing in on us. And last I saw, I think it's less than 3% of the country can travel to Vermont right now without having to quarantine for 14 days. And so significant stressors exist about the fact that under current quarantine restrictions, if an employee travels to visit their family out of state for Thanksgiving or Christmas or otherwise, they're having to quarantine for 14 days upon returning here to the state. And good luck to employers who try to deny their employees vacation requests to see their families during this holiday season, as it creates significant morale issues, as it did over this past summer. So again, I would defer to Kerin to perhaps talk a bit more here about OSHA and the situations that boil over, but I also think it's worth noting that there's a whole slew of different issues that are coming up below that boiling point.
Yeah, so let me get to that boiling point in a second, but what would be like some general advice to avoid getting to the point where we're going to have Kerin give us some advice, before the boiling point, especially, around communication, around travel expectations?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that for most employers, their policies are going to be such that if they wanted to tell employees, you cannot leave the state if you're going to have to quarantine, that you could do that. And if you have a relationship with your employees where you think that that's going to be sustainable, it is a consideration that employers can make. Beyond that, though, if employers are going to allow their employees to leave on vacation, then they need to consider what their operations are going to look like in the aftermath of employees leaving. The difference between Thanksgiving and Christmas in this summer is summer vacations are spread out. You have a couple of employees leaving here and there. For the holidays, everyone leaves at the same time. And so if you don't sort of get your heads around right now how you're going to manage your workforce all leaving the state for Thanksgiving or all leaving the state for the winter holidays, you may end up in a situation where you wake up the Monday after Thanksgiving and you have no one who's able to come into the office. And so, I think as with many, managing many workplace situations, it's important that you get ahead of it. And it's going to be the holidays before you know it.
Yeah. So with that, I guess we'll move on to the ultimate boiling point when things go too far. And it sounds like you have some experience seeing that, Kerin.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're generally seeing a rise in tension, personal tension, as between employees and managers. I think some of what Ben was talking about in terms of those difficult conversations that people are having about, hey, I want to go see my family. Eek, this may not be the right time, because if you go see your family, when you come back, you're going to have to quarantine. I can't lose you for that amount of time. One quick thing that I will say about that is, one way that employers can look at that to bring that temperature down a little bit is that, quarantine has to happen. You get FFCRA leave for that potentially, unless somebody's working from home. So I would say that employers, in order to avoid that boil over, employers need to really sit and be creative about what can I have this person do, even if it's training. So I have clients that have manual laborers who have gone to deer hunting, and have come back and they've needed to do something. And so they've been caught up on their training. And so they've done some training hours, and they've done some, PT tests and various things like that, that employers have been a little bit creative, or, paperwork has been dropped off for them to do and to perform. So things can be done like that too, that employers can think about in a similar way that one might think about reintegrating employees who've been out on workers' comp. You know, you may want to think to yourself, how can I get this person reintegrated? How can we'll get this person set up with a Zoom camera, have them be in on on a discussion with people, fill their schedule as much as you can so that you're really not, that FFCRA time may not have to come in, and that their quarantine can be something that might still be useful. That's one thing. But we certainly are seeing a lot of situations where managers are having to be heads up about literally managing conflict. As Heather mentioned at the top of this, a lot of this also happens to be around discussions about political tensions and things that are going on, whether it's, Supreme Court nominations or whether it's, the actual election itself. Many employers, I think, make the mistake of saying, no political conversations. You can't talk about it. And, if that's what you want to do, that's great, but it's a little bit unrealistic. And in fact, I think it really requires managers to take on managing the change. Hey, listen, happy to have you guys talk about that on break. We really need to not be doing that now because we need to focus on X, Y, and Z. Or if a manager overhears people talking in a way that is raised voices, foul language, clearly starting to get heated, to literally intervene and to manage that and to say, hey, we need to bring the temperature down here and try and deal with this. Because what we're seeing is employees who are coming in and are saying, I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe in the workplace. And that safety issue, can be a real thing, or it can be something where somebody has a heightened sense of fear based on the tension that's around them, or based on their concerns about COVID and how they may be impacted by COVID, being around certain folks. So if you don't address it, what we are seeing is that people are calling OSHA. And they are basically saying, I do not have a safe and healthy work environment. Or they're filing grievances because many union contracts also have a provision that specifically says you must provide a healthy workplace, kind of the contractual version of an OSHA obligation. And so what we are suggesting to people here is, number one, listen to your employees. Make sure that managers are, in fact, listening and checking in with employees on a regular basis. Because if you hear those tensions, if you hear complaints where somebody says, I don't feel safe, managers really need to be proactive. And they need to say, tell me what you mean. What is it that's making you feel unsafe? Get the specifics. Be clear on that. Then if you have an HR department or an upper level manager who can kind of help you coordinate things, make sure that you talk to that person, because this may not be an isolated incident. It may be happening in a different department, it may be happening with that employee and a bunch of other employees. So you want to figure out, what is the problem? What is it that's specifically going on? I think these people are too close to me. So-and-so keeps coming by my office and she doesn't wear a mask. Those are concrete things that you can fix, right? That will stop the problem and it won't boil up. But if somebody says, hey, listen, I don't think there's 6 feet of distance, or there's something that there's not enough hand sanitizer or something like that, address those issues. It's kind of like the old saying that just that one broken window is gonna send the whole neighborhood into trouble if you don't pay attention to kind of some of those issues. So making sure that people are doing that, making sure that managers are specifically addressing those kinds of issues, because what happens if you don't address them is, over the course of time, somebody will then start to say words like unsafe or I'm being harassed by this particular employee, and then you're at a totally different level. Because then they're using buzzwords that actually have legal significance, so that if they decide, I'm not getting enough from you, the employer, I'm picking up the phone. I'm picking up the phone and I'm calling OSHA, or I'm picking up the phone and calling the Attorney General's office, or I'm calling the union and we're going to have a grievance. So small things matter.
And it's interesting how speech, particularly political speech in this climate can drift into things that are considered hostile, as many major decisions are made, and there's implications behind things, even such as our most recent Supreme Court nomination. So I guess, Heather, what do you say to an employee that says, I have a First Amendment protection of my speech, even if I am in the workplace? I mean, that gets a little bit murkier, doesn't it?
Well, it definitely raises some important issues. So first of all, one thing that folks commonly misunderstand is that in the private sector workplace, nobody has a First Amendment right to make certain speech. The First Amendment rights have to do with government restrictions on speech. So in a public sector workplace, if an employee has been, it claims that they've been retaliated against for making certain kinds of statements, that's one thing. But in a private sector workplace, that's just not an issue that can be appropriately raised. As Kerin pointed out, though, however, one thing that employers need to be aware of, in addition to when employees say the words, "I don't feel safe," that kind of language is being used nowadays, not just to convey safe in terms of an OSHA related issue, but can also mean I don't feel safe in this environment because of the views that are being expressed make me feel like this is a hostile work environment based on my protected status. So for example, taking the recent Supreme Court nomination, you can have people discussing that in the workplace. And on one side of things, people can feel that discussions about the appointee can be impacting or making them feel uncomfortable because they feel like it's an attack on one's religious views. On the other hand, there can be others who feel like, depending on the comments that are made about the appointee, that it's an attack or makes them feel not comfortable or safe in the workplace because of their LGBTQ status. So I think employers, when they hear the word safe, an employee saying, "I don't feel safe," have to think about this from an OSHA perspective, and also have to think about it from a anti-discrimination / harassment perspective, and making sure that they're getting to the bottom of what that means and taking appropriate action. The other thing I would say is that, Kerin mentioned it's unrealistic to simply shut down the communications. I think along that lines, in some circumstances, it would be unlawful to shut down certain kinds of communications, not because of First Amendment issues, but because of the National Labor Relations Act, which protects employees, even in non-unionized workplaces, and allows them to talk with one another about terms and conditions of employment, like their wages. And that can mean conversations about what the minimum wage should be, that sort of sound like they may be political, but could in fact be a discussion about what should be happening in that particular workplace for entry-level employees. It can also be discussions by essential workers talking about, how much or what they're being asked to do and whether that's appropriate. It can be discussions about hazard pay or incentive pay for work. All of those things might at first seem COVID related or political, but they can also raise issues under the National Labor Relations Act. So in some cases, it would be unlawful for employers to try and shut down those communications between employees.
Yeah. So, we've talked about kind of just the general fatigue and how it's created some tension, and then, this added layer, as if, it wasn't a difficult enough time in the workplace. We now have a pandemic. Are there any other issues that anyone's seeing kind of come up on the landscape that are causing new tension, or things that you would advise, like in addition to these, if these two things weren't enough, um, something else that employers might be mindful of this season?
I think
You know,
there's
just
lots. I think there's lots of, with that whole concept of, fatigue. We're certainly seeing a lot more people making requests for family medical leave for various things like going to take care of a family member. And so those are not just maybe FFCRA, they may be related to that if it's COVID, but it may not be. There are a lot of people who we're seeing large spikes in mental health claims that people are making. And so if employers have employee assistance, this is a great time to be proactive. Contact your employee assistance program and say, are you running any mindfulness seminars, or are you running anything that we could have here, to help our employees manage some of this tension and some of this strain? We're also seeing managers who are being really smart about and creative about staying in touch with their employees, because here we are, four people talking to one another, from different locations. You have a lot of workplaces where people haven't seen each other for a while. I'm seeing, I was talking to some people yesterday, and you have employers who are doing things like having open office hours where they just keep a video like this up. They're all still doing their work, but they're talking to each other while they're doing it because they haven't seen one another in a while. So they're having conversation and chit chat, or they're having lunches, lunch breaks with one another. It's that personal connection that is actually helping some people maintain, good mental health while they're doing this. Making sure that managers are checking in on employees who are working from home. So family medical leave, ADA, those are things that we always see a lot of, but we're seeing a lot more of them, I think presently. And so managers should be mindful of that. And if they hear that somebody is really struggling, they should be talking to human resources about how do I handle that and how do I do that in a good way. And Heather, to your point earlier, everybody always needs a pocket constitution, because you can say, I'm sorry, but your company name is not anywhere in here. Right? I just looked at the First Amendment and it's not there.
Looks like your company's name is on the front cover, though,
It
Kerin.
might actually be. I'm just saying, I hand them out like candy. It's great. It's not a bad thing.
With that, I'll put a quick plug in for the Chamber's COVID-19 resource guide, which does have some helpful webinars and write-ups about
Okay.
employers who are doing a really good job kind of creating that workplace culture, even in a remote setting, and ways that employers can engage with EAPs and such. We're kind of coming up on the end of our time here. I guess, to me, I feel as if a lot of times, as the non-attorney in this virtual room here, a lot of this just comes back to open and frequent like communication between the employer and the employee that is done as early as possible. And it kind of seems like that's the norm anyway. And with this current crisis, that's really what is needed now more than ever, which is another cliche we hear all the time. Is there any other kind of closing thoughts that you folks have, or?
Well, I think you're right, Austin. It does. I mean, good employer relationships, good employee morale in your workplace does boil down to, in many instances, good open communication and creating a positive workplace culture. And in these difficult times, trying to find, unique and innovative ways to do that. So I think that that's really important. I also think that if employees feel positive about their workplace culture, it can go a long way to you drawing them into being part of the solution here. I mean, look, we all want to travel. we all miss our families at the holidays, all of us, whether you're a manager or not. And I think there is something to be said for the approach of talking with employees about the restrictions that we are all having to undertake. Is because we're all in this together and trying to make our workplace as safe as possible and the community of Vermont in which we live as safe as possible. I don't mean to be too Pollyanna about that, but I do think there's something about how a message is communicated to employees when you're asking them to do difficult things.
Yeah. Anybody else have any closing thoughts?
I mean, just what I would note, Austin, piggybacking off of what Heather and Kerin were talking about, I mean, I think employers are having to maintain workplace harmony, very flexible in so many respects. Kerin talks about how we in our line of work are seeing more and more issues with respect to ADA, disability accommodations, and family medical leave requests. But remember that if we're seeing those many requests, so are the doctors that are having to fill out doctor's notes and request forms and so on and so forth. And employers oftentimes lean on these healthcare providers to provide them with information as to, okay, what is my employee's disability? What are the related restrictions? What is the accommodation that's available to that individual? And that healthcare provider may simply just not be available in the way they were a year ago to provide that information. So employers are having to be more flexible on that end.
Mhm.
The other piece that I would note is just obviously nationwide, in Vermont here as in the country, we've been having national reckonings on so many very serious issues, whether it be with respect to COVID-19, whether it be with respect to national reckonings on systemic racism. And I think many people's natural inclination is that when employees discuss or bring these reckonings that we're going through to work, to say, as my colleagues here have noted, we can't have any of that here. We can't have any political speech here. You need to check that at the door. But so many of these issues also touch on individuals' workplaces. So if someone comes to work and is talking about Black Lives Matter, is wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, is wearing a Black Lives Matter pin, they may be talking about the nationwide discussion we're having with respect to Black Lives Matter. They may also be saying, Black Lives Matter here in my workplace, where I feel we need more diversity, more equity, more inclusion. And so employers need to lean into these difficult discussions. Yeah, it may be easy to say you need to check political speech at the door, but there are deeper discussions beyond that need to be had here.
I think that's a really great point. And I think that, one thing is remembering that we are all human beings and, conversations, sometimes people just need to say what they need to say. And as long as somebody isn't screaming at somebody's face, yelling at somebody, denigrating them, using language that is, patently offensive, meaning it's racist or sexist, or, using terms that are horrible or offensive, frankly, people can have some of that conversation. And maybe the best thing to do is to talk to your employees about giving each other some space. And instead of getting into a big debate, hear somebody, hear what they have to say, maybe go home, read an article, listen to a podcast, try and understand your colleague's perspective before you engage, because that may be part of it too, is that instead of just immediately going back and I've got to talk to this person about, I don't agree, maybe you should just listen, and maybe you should just kind of take it in. And if you are going to engage, do a little bit of homework first before you do it, because that can really help, especially with efforts to understand one another and different perspectives. So, and remembering to model, more than anything, managers, model the kindness and the calm communication that you expect your employees to use with one another.
Certainly with the, divided political climate and people, finding themselves more in their own echo chambers, the workplace is really one of the final places where people actually interact with people with different viewpoints.
Yeah.
So, this is certainly something that's going to continue to, be a topic of conversation for employees and employers, and really grateful that you folks could take the time to sit down with us today and talk through this a little bit, give some guidance and pointers for employers. And we look forward to sitting down with you folks in the future to cover other topics. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks, Austin.
Thank you, Austin.
Take care.